Here we go. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change. It's hard to count them all. You have the information pandemic, the infodemic. We have this bird flu that's killing sea lions in Argentina and could, it's getting into more and more mammals. We have the Gaza tragedy. We have Ukraine. We have so many things going on. And oh, by the way, climate change and climate vulnerability and an epic political year in the United States and many other countries. So with that in mind, we're going to pause and celebrate Earth Day with two friends of mine who I guess for the first time are meeting here via this show, which always makes me happy. Both have taken on for many years in this beat, the sustainability and climate beat, in different ways, in different formats, and different media, and each has a book out. Betsy Kolbert always has a book out, and and it's great to see this new one, which is kind of a novel approach from you. We'll get into. I'll mention your other books in a minute, and with the illustrator Wesley Allsbrook, you did kind of an alphabet soup of climate complexity. In fact, there's one complexity. It's not C for complexity. There's another O. O is for. I'll show it in a minute. You both get into the complexity issue in your books, and Bill, with Life as We Know It Can Be, incredibly personal navigation of these issues. I love how you frame it around these letters to your young son. You have an older child, and we'll talk about all that in a minute. So B is for books, and here we are. Bill, I think you can only be on for a half hour. Is that right?
I can go longer. No, I'm good.
Okay, well, let's see how it goes.
As long as you need me, Andy. Yeah.
So Earth Day, 1970 is getting to be a long time ago. And for those who don't recall, Richard Nixon was a big part of Earth Day. He had launched the Environmental Protection Agency. He gave the greenest State of the Union address any president has ever given around that time. And here he is planting a tree. Lyndon Johnson, his wife, was better known for trees and bushes and planting things, but this was Nixon. Joe Lelyveld wrote the daily story about my former editor at the New York Times. He was the day reporter writing about Earth Day in 1970, and it was celebratory. It was kind of like people forget that it was people were more dancing than shouting. It was interesting, and the environment has changed so much since then. And I'm a songwriter, a singer, and Tom Paxton wrote this song on a bus to the first Earth Day celebration. Whose garden was this? And it's while the celebratory aspects were there too, there was also this sense of loss. And what he does in this song, to me, is reflected somewhat in both books, because he's dealing with time. Whose garden was this? It must have been lovely. Did it have flowers? I've seen pictures of flowers, and I'd love to have smelled one. It's a look back in time. Tell me again, I need to know. The forest had trees, the meadows were green. So it's kind of the inverse of your book, Bill. And you're kind of looking forward. But I think we're all trying to grapple with these issues of how to tell these stories. And today's Earth Day, I think live right now, there's a lot of climate emergency celebrations, actions around the country. In the United States, there's this effort to get Biden to declare one formally, something I think it would be very ill-advised. I've written about that, and I just got from a climate scientist, Bob Kopp, just sent me something I'm going to plop on my blog shortly about why he thinks it's a bad idea too. So it's a turbulent time, and then we have these books. I wanted, and I just hope that everyone follows you both. You haven't abandoned social media, and I think for those who,
although it's sure getting harder and harder to
talk about polluted environments. I do think I see Twitter now. It's kind of like a polluted. It's a wonderful body of water that got terribly polluted. So they're like this scum on the surface. And if you dive beneath the surface, you can find each other and still do magical things.
The metaphor I use in my book is, it feels like going into the prison exercise yard the first day after a wrongful conviction.
Oh,
I'm really, I'm very, I don't understand. I get only advertisements for like right wing, causes these days in my Twitter feed. So I feel like either those are the only people, they're just flooding the zone,
yeah.
or the whole algorithm has been broken. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I'm going to jump right to, I'm going to focus on Bill initially first, but I wanted to jump to the N word in Betsy's book, and I hope we could all talk about it a little bit, because as journalists and writers and communicators, we are all about narratives ultimately. Oh, but actually, hold on. I've got to, breaking news. The Osprey just landed.
Oh. Beautiful.
This is right up we are right. My house is right around the corner on that little creek you're looking at there, here in Maine, and in Wabanaki Territory, a place called Hancock County. And these ospreys, if you don't mind, we'll break away from briefly. They had a terrible time last year for a strange reason related to Earth Day. Bald eagles are resurgent, as we all know, because of the victory over the misuse of DDT. But a bald eagle last summer took the chicks from this nest live on this webcam.
Wow.
So these poor ospreys had to start all over again. And here they are starting all over again. Something about that reminds me of the human journey these days, change, predatory things, a bit predatory delay, predatory challenges face us, but we, endurance actually matters quite a bit. So that's live from down east Maine.
So
right?
beautiful.
It is fantastic.
And let's go back to the book. So narratives. I mean, that's a weird thing, right? Eagles are coming back and they're killing ospreys. What's the narrative there? It's interesting. So how do you, I'd like to get you each both a comment on what you think about, both of your books describe complexity. Bill, you have a phrase in your book about whiplash, or, kind of the back and forth quality of the things you portray in the book, good news and bad news. And definitely as you go through the alphabet in Betsy's book, the same thing happens. There's a lot of, so is narrative still, what do you think of when you think of narrative, in this current?
I think it is. I think that we are made of stories. I think all of our borders and religions and currencies and corporations are just stories we agree upon in that moment in time, and they're under constant revision. I think they're the most powerful things we have. I grew up with a story that in order to show my love for somebody, I had to spend 3 months' salary on a diamond, because diamonds are super rare and forever. And in reality, it rains diamonds on other planets. We have gigatons of diamonds under the ground and above it. It's super rare in the known galaxy? Wood, trees, and so
right.
how we value things are based on the stories we agree upon in that given moment. And that's what I set out to do is and I learned from the best, including Elizabeth, who teaches every one of her articles is a masterclass in finding really compelling stories. And there's a math and a physics to great storytelling, from Dune or Star Wars to the Iliad. And once you understand those and sort of apply them to the task at hand, and if we can't make the greatest challenge and calamity in human history compelling in some way down at the granular level, however we focus our lenses, we're not doing our job, right? And so, but it is all sort of a reflection of who's writing it and who's telling that narrative. And when I would, at least for me, my first few drafts of this book were so dark. I was supposed to turn it in a couple of years ago, and I was focused purely on the just fire hose of peer-reviewed dread, and nothing had happened. Joe Manchin still was being Joe Manchin, and it looked like nothing, and it would be basically a eulogy I was writing for my kid about the planet he had just joined, and it was going to be a cathartic record. But then you start to focus on the dreamers and the doers and the ideas, and Elizabeth does it brilliantly the way she lays it out there. That it is good for the soul. I found, as Mr. Rogers taught me, when things look grim on TV, look for the helpers. There's always helpers. And the more I meet, the more hope I get.
And Betsy, what do you think of? Yeah, I think Bill's onto something, because everything the New Yorker puts in the magazine is a narrative in essence. Or can that mislead us too when we face complexity, deep complexity?
Well, definitely this book, Bill took the approach, which, I think is very smart. And, one of the things that climate change is, I think, a very difficult narrative. It lacks agency, and that is a real problem. And Bill, did a very personal book. And that's a way of injecting agency into the story. And that's obviously very smart. In H is for Hope, my idea was to try to tell many different stories which have, and sort of break down this story, which is on some level everything, everywhere, all at once. So break it down and put it back together again. But I do think it's, unfortunately, it's not your usual story. It's the greatest challenge, as Bill said, that we've ever faced. And it's also, on some level, the greatest challenge. That's obviously, I wasn't around, for the Peloponnesian War. That was probably challenging too. But, it's a huge narrative challenge. And I think we see everyone, a lot of very smart people, a lot of very creative people struggling with how to tell this really complicated, everywhere story in a way that's compelling. And also, I want to say new. I mean, climate change will always be with us. It's not going anywhere, and it's only getting worse. I can assure you of that for the foreseeable future. And that is a really hard story. So as Bill was also alluding to, well, we do get glimmers of good news. There is a lot of good news out there, but the overarching story remains a very grim one. And, how you communicate both of those things in an honest way is very difficult.
For sure. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphs, which get at this to me too. There's a guy named Holger Ragnar. He's one of these sort of gray-haired European analysts of energy trends, kind of like Vaclav Smil, who I think you both know, been at this for decades. And long time ago, in an email exchange with him and Jesse Osabel and others, I was asking them to revisit some of their old graphs on decarbonization of primary energy, which sounds wonky, but it's basically you add up all the global energy use and how much of that is from carbon versus how much carbon is committed through that. And it's a graph that shows no real attachment to things like the Framework Convention on Climate Change, to the invention of solar, not yet, It's a graph that seems to have its own life. There's some, as you can see there, it's got some tweaks and a little upper and downer, but not really within a human narrative. And I showed the other graph, of course. My first article on cover story on global warming was 1988, and I have this humility factor, right, to say storytelling that we all do. Seems sometimes we attach all kinds of narratives to this big thing, but I do wonder whether we're missing the bigger thing. H is for hyper object, to use that word that Timothy Morton, the philosopher, came up with too. How do you keep your energy level up when you're both producing way more stuff than I have been recently? I've been focused more on these conversations and on writing. So what do you do, and how does it relate to the average person to keep energized, trying to grapple with these trends and narratives? Maybe Bill first.
Okay. We play it as it comes in the world of TV. and interest from the shows. I'm really gratified and lucky to be at a place that really believes in this beat. Our new boss, we've been through a bit of corporate shakeup, which is pretty common these days. But our new boss, Mark Thompson, is very keen on the climate beat. We just had a staff-wide meeting about ideas on how to bring the story into every desk and give agency to the business reporters and even the entertainment reporters to see how storytelling is changing. Like this is the beat, I think, that covers all. It's what attracted me to it. People still see it as sort of a menu item for pollsters around the elections. I argue it's the whole restaurant and everything matters in there. And so there will be a study will come out, in Nature or NASA will put out some new data or a temperature record is set. And there's always interest for me to be on TV and try to put that into context. So big, different challenge there as opposed to writing for readers online. Digital video is now so many people consume it in minute-long bites. But what I've learned going back to sort of the basics of story is like Hemingway's, I'll write you a short story in 6 words. The idea that the rules of story structure can work on in a Twitter sized or TikTok sized video. It can work in obviously book long form. What I love doing documentaries. And so I'll always be working in between the breaking news stuff, a big hour for the whole story. Anderson Cooper, I'm doing one right now around the themes of my book around adaptation and going around to see how construction is changing and food supply chains are changing. And so that keeps me sort of focused. It keeps me evened out. And to Elizabeth's prior point is I don't think the average public appreciates a fraction of the enormity of the emergency and what is going away in real time and what it means to have ocean temperatures set a record every day for the last year and a half. And there's always something on the front burner, pun intended, that makes climate a back burner topic in a lot of places. And I think it's going to come forward more. But it is that, again, we struggle with how should we tell this story with every color in the coloring box, in the crayon set, every emotion. Some days this story can be told as a sad ballad, and some days it's a John Philip Sousa march to action. It just depends. And I use the 5 stages of grief as a structure in my book too. Like everybody's in a different one of those anger, bargaining, denial, depending on where you are in the country in that moment in time. And so the more we talk about it, we'll strike on things that we see really resonate, and they may only work for a little bit, and then we'll have to adjust accordingly.
Right. And Betsy, how do you keep at it?
Well, I don't want to, I don't want to deny that sometimes I think, well, let's just do like a really, fun story on, someone who's, an artist doing, something cool or stupid or goofy. The thought crosses my mind every other day. But, part of it is, what are journalists looking for? Well, they're looking for the big story. And, for better or worse, the 3 of us for, different or the same reasons were attracted to what, I think we all agree is the biggest story going right now. And will be the biggest story going forward. And so, on some level, it's a privilege to be, working on something that you think is so important. But it is going back to the narrative problem, a problem that, that keeps repeating that only gets worse. That is, as I say, narratologically challenging. So I spend a lot of my time, thinking what is there to say that hasn't been said already. So much has been said, and yet, we used to have these conversations when I was at the Times about covering political campaigns. You say something, once and people aren't listening, and you have to say it again and again and again and again. I think that, Bill is right, that I think this is an issue that will only rise in people's consciousness. because it has to, because reality has a way of hitting people in the head, no matter what, they might want to believe, or at least so I still believe, I still cling to that belief. But I think that what we found after, what I've found after 20 years of covering climate change, after 20 years of listening to this, manufactured debate is, it's kind of incredible. It's really incredible that we're in this situation right now, as, record after record falls, and the physics of climate change they're so unrelenting. And I completely agree with Bill. I don't think people appreciate, even, when there's a terrible fire, there are fires in Canada that, leave the sky, bright red all summer. I don't think people appreciate the real depths of the crisis that we're in, and how difficult it is to turn this around. It's not turning around a super tanker, it's turning around a whole planet. And we have spent a long time getting into this mess. And everyone, some of us way, way, way more actively than others, is participating in making it worse at this point. And that's another really hard aspect of the climate change story. There are villains. I certainly think the oil industry has behaved villainously. I think the coal industry has behaved villainously. But at the end of the day, we are all participants in this problem. Certainly all of us in America, certainly all of us in the developed world. And that's another very difficult story to tell, where your readers and your listeners and your viewers, are part of the problem.
Well, I would like to go through some of the specifics in both books, and we'll start with Bill. Just on Friday, I did a conversation with David Ropeik, who's written a really important book on cancer, on we need to subdivide cancer into the ones that really are dangerous and ones that we can live with, that we do live with. And he started his book with an apology. And I was thinking, wow, I haven't seen a book starting with an apology. And then here I am reading your book over the weekend. It starts with an apology. Dear River. River, of course, is your young son, your second child. And you say, I'm sorry we broke the sea and sky and shortened the wings of the nightingale. I'm sorry that the Great Barrier Reef is no longer great, that we value Amazon more than the Amazon, which I love. By the way, I really like the way you turn a phrase. You really
Thank you, Ryan.
Have a deep skill. I think your TV writing seems to help you cut through jargon in ways I find really, really well done. And that the waterfront neighborhood where you are growing up could be condemned by rising seas. The Earth I joined in '67 is gone now, and no one knows what kind of planet was. So what? Tell us a little bit about the format. Obviously, it's letters to your son mostly.
Yeah.
And that must have come with some grappling, including how your family will.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the early part of the book is to him. The later part to my daughter, Olivia, who's 16 years older. And she informed my work when I realized when she was 11, she was going to turn my age in the year 2050. And I pitched a show, The Wonder List, like what will be left of these places, how many elephants in Botswana, how many tigers in India. And then at the height of the pandemic in 2020, I become a new old dad at age 52. And I'm looking out at a world on lockdown. And his early months, I would go be covering the George Floyd protests, and having covered climate full time for a couple of years, just had a really dystopian view on what I just brought this kid into. And my dad was the kind of guy, he was the smartest high school dropout I ever met, and loved the wilderness. And we'd go out backpacking in the deserts or mountains out west. And he taught me like this ethic of, isn't this amazing? Just wait till some a-hole puts a golf course right there, like a sense of wonder and worry for every landscape, and a big student of human nature. And so when I started the book, honestly, it was like, where's this kid going to live? Like, what parallel on the map? What kind of house should he build? What will be his energy supply? What kind of food will he be eating when he's my age? And so looking for those practical stories, you find people, just inspiring people who are creating hurricane-proof homes in Florida, or solar villages somewhere here, or the passive houses out west, or, you hear just inspiring, innovative ideas from folks who wrestle with the same angst that we have, and are trying to fight that sliding baseline syndrome, where you take your kids for walks in the woods and the bird song gets a little, less loud every trip until the kid doesn't know what they're missing. So how do we fight that? How do we, not just prepare them, set them up with the tools to fortify themselves physically for a world where their pyramid of needs has been scrambled, but psychologically too, how to process this story, how to lean into society at a time when most people completely want to drop out,
Right.
and I guess there's something about freeing about writing it to my kid. I got to use my own biography, which is all over the map, and try to tie these lessons together in a really personal way to him. And I just have too much, I don't know, Midwestern humility to write a self-help book, but I like that there's dozens of ideas for people who are maybe renovating their home, to think about how they fill their temperature needs going forward in a more sustainable way, turning anxiety into sort of sense of action, agency, and connection at a time when we've invented like the golden age of self-isolation with our screens.
Right.
Now more than ever, got to get out in that world.
That's just really so great. Yeah, here's that line: "You'll turn 30 in 2050." It's quite, when we think, I think children do give us that temporal awareness to a certain extent, as do dogs, as do,
Yeah.
on the other way, they compress life into a shorter span, and we grapple with the.
I use them as sort of breathing units of time measurement, right? To say the day you learn to open kitchen cabinets, and stand on your own, I put on a packed body armor and went to cover the inauguration, like these seismic
Right.
events in just his little life are really striking to me. And I think I encourage others to do the same and to use those lifespans to measure what's happened to your favorite fishing hole or your hiking trail or, the water in your town.
Right. And you have a bunch of storylines of other people along. You tell some powerful stories about yourself, including almost drowning in that opening section on physiology, which caught my attention. But then you talk about Eunice's and Joseph's and Dan's, and I just had this recent conversation with Ed Humes, who has a great book out on garbage, on waste, and he talks about Marge. There's a woman here in Maine, Sarah Nichols, who helped to push through Maine's new law that's going to force producers of the companies that produce the packaging and everything have to pay for the recycling efforts at the town level. It's really cool, and it's spreading.
Okay.
There was a woman named Marge who was like a key to getting that all done. So Marge is like a thing. We need more Marges.
Yeah, we do.
And I had a conversation with Jigar Shah, the head of the Energy Department's loan program, 2 years almost after the infrastructure bill, and he was saying we need 19,500 local people. Every town has to have someone who spends a couple hours a week. So tell us about the Eunices, Josephs, and Dans, and is there some common element to the stories you tell, Bill? And we're going to get to Betsy's narratives in a minute.
Sure.
What are some of these properties that we need to propagate?
Yeah. Well, the Eunice, as you mentioned, is Eunice Newton Foote, who was just a suffragist who discovered really kind of the greenhouse effect in her backyard laboratory and was just questioning conventional wisdom. Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen and was a dissenter, who had his laboratory burned down at a time, but just had the courage of his convictions to speak up and question just fundamental things in life taken for granted. And, I grew up working construction out west. We built houses with skinny little walls and giant furnaces and air conditioners instead of the other way around. And, went down a history lesson of passive house construction was invented in Illinois in the 70s during the oil embargo, and just basically copying the Adobe or the Pueblo people's construction idea with modernized windows and, southern exposure to capture free passive energy from the sun. And now this is taking off, and the expert you have is the one at Cornell Tech, this
Right.
huge, 26-story passive house tower. Just the way I grew up in a world of such abundant waste that we didn't notice.
Right.
And really smart people are stripping that out. So you don't, as a customer, a part of this, you don't notice the sacrifice, but it can be orders of magnitude more efficient, and a mindset around that. Just looking at everything in your lives and wondering, how can we make that 10% better? And, a protopian approach to daily existence, and knowing that the more you can get done the fastest, the more you can save, hopefully.
And you have a section on NIMBY and YIMBY, which gets to some of the themes in Betsy's book too. Can we flip that script?
Yeah, exactly. And it's, there have been studies that come down to, when you look at wind turbine resistance, the average, group protesting is 26, not 26% of the population, 26 people who are super motivated
Right.
to keep the landscape or the skyline looking their way. And I, at least in my reporting, you look at Texas now as the greenest state in the country, and could be a magnet for industry that wants to use all that wind and solar they got pumping now, rearrange industrial corridors, rearrange population centers, folks, the YIMBYs, the smart YIMBYs, and even looking to Montana, where they passed this housing law, basically outlawed single family zoning because they didn't want to become another California dealing with a housing crisis and homelessness. The smart YIMBYs, it feels like, can really determine their fate in the near term, and getting active on your utility commission, and deciding what the energy mix is in your town, and arguing for more of your indigenous energy wherever you happen to live, if that's geothermal, wind, wherever you are. Those folks are going to do as much good as any delegate at the next COP, I think.
You have a section on something that Betsy wrote a whole book on, SRM, solar radiation management and geoengineering, something I've written and thought about for a very, very, very long time. Betsy, your book the new one does not have a G for geoengineering, but what's your take on where we're at right now? There seems to be a lot more stuff percolating. There's a new methane removal startup there. So let's just talk about this briefly, Betsy, first on what you learned in doing your book, and then do you think, is this being forced forward by the sense of extreme change that we're seeing right now?
Well, I think we should divide sort of geoengineering into two baskets. One being carbon removal, so the methane removal proposal that you talked about, and a lot of stuff going. I get an announcement every day from some company that's either moving into this space or expanding in this space of sucking carbon dioxide out of the air one way or the other. And then there's the manipulating things to either brighten clouds or make the stratosphere more reflective, so less direct sunlight hits the earth, which we'll call solar geoengineering or whatever you want to call it. So I do think those are diverging, and definitely there's a lot of money in the Inflation Reduction Act for carbon dioxide removal, and so people are going to grab that money. Now whether that's a good idea, whether that's money well spent or not, I'm not sure, I'll be frank, because it is still way, 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 way cheaper not to emit that carbon than to take it out of the atmosphere. So should we be putting money into that? That is, I think, actually a really big question that we're not sort of answering, but just sort of, going with the flow here. And then there's the issue of, are we going to find ourselves in such desperate straits that we're going to have to do something like, solar geoengineering, putting reflective particles up in the stratosphere. And I think we're going to hear more and more talk about that. We are actually not seeing more and more. I also just got an email recently that this one experiment that the Harvard solar geoengineering group was pursuing, one tiny little physical experiment, that they've abandoned that. It was just too fraught. So I don't see a lot of actual experimental work going on. I don't know whether that barrier will be broken soon or not. There's sort of people freelance geoengineering, which, would be funny if it weren't so, awful maybe. But I think, as Frank Coich, a professor of chemistry at Harvard, told me, and I think it's, just a fact, we don't have any way to deal with climate change in a short-term way. Once we reach a certain temperature, we don't have any way to reel things back besides, or no one has any ideas, no one has come up with any ideas besides solar geoengineering. So it's when things get, if and when things get really, really bad, we don't have any tools in the toolbox. So I think this one is going to keep popping up.
And Bill, you have a significant section on the sort of entrepreneurial aspect of this and the science. To me, I'm seeing a repeat of the pattern I saw with iron fertilization of the oceans, where one guy, Russ George, kind of toxified the whole arena by throwing a small amount of iron filings in the sea off British Columbia with a partnership with an Indian tribe. And but he was way out in front of the more conventional research, and then the sort of hardcore left environmentalists jumped all over it.
Yeah,
Let's talk of a ban, and I'm worried about like Make Sunsets. These guys are already selling avoided tons based on an untested thing, lofting balloons of sulfur. And I think it, it's sort of these like freelancey efforts, as Betsy said, toxify the more serious questions, and probably led in part to what happened with the Harvard project. So where do you, what's your sense given what you had in the book?
Yeah, I agree that that what was poo-pooed a few years ago as just completely nuts is that, very smart people are saying this is that in case of emergency break glass idea, that if we do need it, and it is the only thing we got, we should have that data now, and we should at least study it. And James Hansen, of course, the OG of climate warnings, he came out in favor of it. Michael Mann and others knocked it down and said, he was making the argument that since we changed shipping regulations, changed the chemistry, what's coming out of smokestacks, we've already futzed with the stratosphere in accidentally for generations now. Commercial travel, now they just did, and the equipment that. What gives me a little bit of pause that some freelance billionaire isn't going to just start doing this is that the planes you need to go that high, there's only a handful of them. NASA just sent up a mission last year to take the first test of the stratosphere in generations above Alaska, and they found that space junk, the particles from launches and then satellites as they break up, come back to Earth, is now 10% of what is in the high sky. And we don't know how that's either masking or, what effect that's having on the very complex Earth systems, right? But yeah, I mean, and the idea that you would get countries, rivals, and friends to orchestrate these sorties, and then when you stop, does the heat just come roaring back? And I think it just says a lot about where we are that we're even having the conversation at this level,
Yeah, unfortunately. There's a new one, a startup in Switzerland that was pushed on Twitter the other day. They're doing atmospheric methane removal. It's actually, there's some interesting stuff in this. It's low level. This is down in the troposphere, well down toward the surface, more like cloud brightening. And they have this idea that there'll be jets, a fleet of small jets to do it. And I did joke about this. I said, maybe this is a worthy use of all those G5 jets taking very north to Davos.
Yes, if you're going to have a private jet, you must use it
right
X amount of hours a month to spray aerosols in the sky.
Yes, we'll
I saw that tweet of yours, and I meant to look into it. What do they claim they're going to do?
It's a methane removal technology, and they're actually there are other people working on this. It's chloride. I'd have to.
Yeah, you say ferric iron chloride.
Yeah, iron chloride molecules then essentially expedite the removal of the turning methane into CO2, which is very low. Okay. And it also, they say this done at low level, it also will do iron fertilization at the same time because the particles settle into the ocean. Mm-hmm. So we'll see how that plays out. As with all these things, I see a lot of talk and not enough actual serious research.
The other thing I think that is honestly so dangerous about what's going on, and not even talking about the Make Sunsets guys, which you alluded to, who are, doing their own little geoengineering, not in the stratosphere. I don't know what they think they're doing exactly, but anyway, and selling credits already is, I think there's a huge appetite. I think, the greater that the more difficult and painfully climate change bites, the more appetite there is for greenwashing, unfortunately. And I think that we are, just being flooded with stuff. And I think that a lot of this carbon removal, first it was carbon credits, which is a really, really broken market and never was a functional market. And much of the news out of that realm is pretty bad and pretty not quite actually crooked in some cases. Although in some cases actually crooked.
Some cases actually, yes.
In some cases actually crooked. In some cases just, really badly monitored and just, ad hoc and glued together. But the same is true of carbon removal. I mean, I claim I'm, growing kelp or doing whatever and then sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. And that's taking that carbon out of circulation. Who's measuring that? How do you measure that? Iron fertilization, how do you measure that? These are really, we're giving away carbon credits, and there's a huge fight right now over, who should be, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but what companies should be eligible for these sustainable aviation fuel credits. They get into, some people, some ethanol growers, corn growers really want to get their hands on those credits. And if you do X, Y, and Z, are you sequestering carbon in the soil? Should you get those credits? So a lot of money, unfortunately, is going to be going into things that are not making a difference to the climate. And we don't have the money or the time to do that. And that really, really worries me, because I think there's such a hunger to believe in a lot of this stuff. And there's so much money out there going to it for good and bad reasons that that seems to me to be another, dead end that we could be going down that will not make any difference. As I say, some people get very wealthy off of it, but it won't change the bottom line.
Yeah. So I want to go through your alphabet a little bit, Betsy. There's one last aspect of Bill's book I wanted to touch on, which is, you built this around Maslow, around psychology and how humans behave and what we seek in life, including self-sufficiency, which to me, the self part can cut against the idea of what's needed and having a truly ubiquitously safer relationship with climate and energy, because the self is you and your family. But I know the book gets into the wider, how you make yourself wider than just you.
Right.
So this sounds kind of touchy-feely and abstract. So how does it kind of crystallize for you in terms of what you would say to a friend at a basketball game?
Well, it's a long discourse. I went into Maslow's original ideas when he wrote the original theory on human motivation, which took the shape of a pyramid. In the late 30s, the tip of it was self-actualization, which was people seized on for license to do whatever you want to do. You want to play for the Yankees? You want to open the artisanal cupcakery of your dreams? You should do that thing. And over time, Maslow became disenchanted with his own theories, because people would go, hey, what about Adolf Hitler? He was sort of self-actualized as a murderer. He did really well. And so he's in his journals, I got all his journals towards the end of his life, and he was ready to scrap it. And he realized that the people that he was fixated on, these CEOs and generals, these self-actualized characters, really weren't about self at all, that they transcended. It was less about what they wanted to do. It was more about their adherence to these values like truth, which I think is a part of every good journalist. Truth is a being value that is as much a part of them as their spleen, right? Or if it's justice, you go into law because you carry that being value. And that the societies that encourage these, 14 being values will be the healthiest. And I looked for this not just in the green tech CEOs who are pitching me these ideas, like looking to the characters of the people trying to make a difference these days. And those who in the face of crisis, like Archie Kalepa, the lifeguard in Maui, who just held his community together after the Lahaina wildfires, who had so many of these values just being proven under fire, literally, that it brought me back to that. And if you, I don't know, organize your consumption, what kind of brands you frequent, looking for these values, looking for things that make things a little bit better.
Right.
It's something I'm just trying to, and teach my kid, and self-sufficiency is important, but not to be a loner. Because even Maslow
Right.
looked at like the off the grid life in the woods on Walden Pond as
Yeah.
really indulgent, because they're using an axe that somebody else made in a factory that didn't have the luxury of, dropping off the grid. And we need each other more than ever now,
Right.
with concentrated sort of virtual energy networks, with my batteries, take some juice from my battery, and I'll, when you need it. And building those communities is, how do we start those conversations, come what
Yeah.
may, on the wider scale.
Absolutely. And Dan Siegel, who's this psychologist, actually, I think he's a psychiatrist out in LA who I've gotten to know for many years. He talks about how we have a we map and a me map in our that our mind and our what we consider ourselves can be much bigger than ourselves if our we map is bigger. Meaning, what you think of your brain, how much of your brain is in here versus out there. Really interesting way of looking at the self as a bigger entity. So, Betsy, again, you've written these epic and quite dire books about these issues, and then you dove in here in a playful way. It was for the magazine first, as with Wesley Allbrook, who was going to be on the show earlier, and it's playful, but and it's alphabet bookish, but it has a through line.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, no, definitely it has a through line. I mean, it is, the hope was to pull you along, I mean, it's done in the fashion of sort of an ABC kids book, but it's not a kids book. It's a pretty adult book, and to sort of pull you along through, as we were discussing, at the top of this, the complexities of climate change, which, can seem overwhelming, and maybe people even turn away from the whole issue. So as I say, it was sort of an attempt to figure out a way to tell all of these different stories, all of these levels of the story. Yeah, thank you. There's technology, politics, the hard science of it, the social, geopolitical aspect of it, all of these things. And they can pull in very different directions too. And so the hope of the book was to sort of, come to build things up, and then it's a little bit of a roller coaster. I hope, sort of emotional roller coaster that adds some sort of narrative arc to the proceedings.
Yeah, and then some of them kind of mesh together. Hope, and then Inflation Reduction Act, obviously, which is related to jobs.
Yes, isn't it good that H and I are right next to each other? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really great. You start with Arrhenius. I was interested in that A. I wrote a book about weather and climate history, which you saw, Betsy, years ago. And Arrhenius was such an interesting character. And you captured this. He really did nail the turning a lot of coal into CO2 changes the climate. But he came of age in the great industrial age. And he thought that was going to be a good thing. He kind of gets at this weird reality that you describe in the book here. You say that who among us is really any different than him, kind of saying, isn't this great? But what do you think about this sort of historic context when we think about, he came of age at a time when the early days of modern capitalism, construction, he was in Sweden, a coal country. So
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things, of course, is that Arrhenius, came upon climate change via the ice ages. He was really interested in what had caused the ice ages, and if you're in Sweden, which a country that was completely covered in ice, in the relatively recent geological past, the incipient ice age seemed like probably more of a threat
right.
at the time than climate change. But there are a couple things that I think is account for his very sunny vision. One, as you say, he lived in a cold and part of the world. which might benefit and truly still might have to see some benefits from climate change, even as its shorelines erode. Although Sweden is probably still experiencing isostatic rebound from the last ice age. So the land is probably still rising very slowly. But he also, how much coal was being burned at the time compared to now, a relatively trivial amount. And he also made a pretty critical error, which was a pretty important error that was not really discovered until Keeling started actually measuring CO2 in the atmosphere, which is that he thought that the vast majority of CO2 we put up there would be absorbed relatively quickly in the oceans. And now we know that, roughly a third of the CO2 that we're putting up there is being absorbed relatively quickly in the oceans. And eventually, pretty much all of the CO2 that we put up there will be absorbed by the oceans. But in those thousands of years before that happens, we will see a lot of climate change. And he didn't see that, didn't understand that, thought that the absorption would be much more than it actually is. And as I said, that is an error in that was committed, and people still sort of thought that until the 50s. And then when Charles David Keeling showed that that was not the case, that was when people started to say, and by actually measuring what was happening to CO2 in the air, that was when in the early 60s, you got a lot of, that was a huge wake-up call. And that should have been a huge wake-up call for everyone, 60 years ago. But here we are 60 years later.
Yeah, we sure are. And I have to bring up A is for Anthropocene also, because you just wrote a piece about the Anthropocene, something we've both thought about for a long time, that I proposed in my 1992 book. And so just very briefly, you kind of make the point that Anthropocene, this word, deserves a place in the rhetoric of sustainability still. And Bill, I don't know if you've thought about this. It's so, one point I made when I wrote about this in 2016 is that I don't think there's ever been a survey, but I guarantee you that let's say at least 95% of the people on the planet have never heard the word. We are all kind of in this little bubbly, I describe it as the corner of the head of a pin, hiding in a haystack, is even thinking about, is this the Anthropocene? But maybe a quick thought from each of you on that grand scale idea of what we're up to right now.
Well, I also want to say that I think, how many people, if you ask them what geological, epoch are we living in, how many people would say, oh, it's the Holocene?
Oh, same thing. Yeah, no.
Yeah. So yes, it's a small fraction of the world that concerns itself with, geological epochs. But I do think that, it has become a sort of a very handy, I think it captures, it's a great term, and your term was a great term too. The Anthropocene, maybe it was better, in fact, than the Anthropocene, but here we are. Yeah. But it's a very succinct way of encompassing this enormous changes that the Earth is the Earth in our hands is experiencing. And so I think, whether, as I wrote in that essay, whether we are officially going to be in the Anthropocene, according to the stratigraphic, tables, it doesn't. It matters to stratigraphers, but journalists and artists and filmmakers are going to, continue to use the term.
Yep, Carl Savina calls it the obscene.
Yeah. Yes, so there are a lot of great words. The mix,
I know.
The age of slime, the homogenous-scene. There are a lot of proposals.
Necrocene, capitalocene. So Bill, I don't imagine for CNN audiences, it's the kind of thing that taking it to that level.
But I do think that what we're trying to get at is translate Earth scales, geologic time scales down to us. Right. And the device I use in the book is 4.5 billion years old. That's way too many zeros. So if we scale that down to a 45-year-old house, and Earth is a house, the Himalayas were installed 5 years ago. Humans moved in 3 months ago. And the Industrial Revolution began when I started this sentence. And in that just blink of Earth time, we've changed the chemistry of the sea and sky and the course of rivers and blown the tops off of mountains. The way my dad used to say it is, hold out your arm. That's all of Earth's history. Now take a nail file and scrape just the tip of your little finger twice, and you've erased all of human history. Like, how do we convey our enormous power and the things, and because it seems like these things are happening in such slow motion, we have sliding baseline syndrome and all of that. Yeah, how do we talk about it better? I think the
Right.
language that we use around it, and argue, the more we are arguing about the Anthropocene, the guys down at the Petroleum Club tucking into a steak dinner on a Saturday, they're not talking about this stuff, right? And I
No,
think they like our confusion and lack of clarity around it.
absolutely. Yeah, and that's more of the language I enjoy in your book. So I was interested. A lot of people have been writing books about climate hope lately and things, and it's mostly about social and behavioral issues. And you also have D's for despair, I think, and which is just a 2-word entry. I like that. It was like basically despair is a waste of time.
And
But
a sin.
Betsy, yeah, right. That's actually what it says. But Betsy, your entry on hope is about batteries. Could you just talk about that briefly? And we only have can you go a little beyond the turn of the hour, or are you guys locked in on other stuff?
Yeah, no, I can go for a couple more minutes.
Oh, that'd be great.
So I think that a lot of the hopeful news, springs nowadays, and certainly there is a lot of room for hope on political organization, but it's hard to say in the very polarized political climate that we're in, that we're seeing that there's a lot of hopeful news out there in the political realm. And I think a lot of the most hopeful news is coming out of the tech sector these days. And so I, focused on some of what I thought were the more interesting innovations in that particular chapter. It's not, I went to visit a company, Form Energy, and since the book, since this was written, it's building a plant to develop these batteries in West Virginia, even as we speak. So this is moving forward. And the idea is, if you're moving to renewable sources, like wind and solar in particular, they're intermittent. Everyone knows that. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. You need lots of energy storage. And there was just a piece today I saw that California, is dumping solar power. Sometimes the grid is just so overloaded with solar these days that they have to dump it. And the same is certainly true for wind. It's called curtailment. Sometimes there's just so much wind you can't put it on the grid. Right. So the idea is here you would use these huge batteries that basically use the process of rusting, believe it or not, right, to not just to reverse rusting stores energy, and then you let these batteries rust basically, and you can get that energy out again. And for utility scale energy storage, we need some breakthroughs. We need some really big ideas, and this is potentially one of them.
And Bill, you talk about Texas. One thing that struck me when I was at ProPublica right in that year after Trump got elected was I wrote some piece at that time that said 17 of the 25 Republican states that were suing Obama in court over his Obama Clean Power Plan were actually on track to meet the emissions for all these other reasons that you describe in Texas, where wind is making money, therefore. And what that says to me is quite often the path forward is not about centering climate change. It's about just these energy change. It looks like can happen without getting into some of these political traps.
The sooner I think we can attach just that individuals' health, wealth, and happiness is a climate story, and how those things are managed. I got similarly geeked out as Elizabeth with thermal batteries. The air rust ones are so cool too, but there's startups that are just using giant blocks of carbon, like just a hot rock in a box, like whatever caveman moved a hot rock from the fire to wherever he was sleeping, invented a thermal battery. Now they're doing it with super insulated containers, right, and using that abundant wind or sun, heating up blocks of carbon until they glow, to 2,500 degrees, enough to make steel or run a factory, and not just move it with liquid, but crack open the box like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and with the light that beams out, catch that in the form of electricity. Right. And Con Edison is trying to green, the steam you see coming out of the streets here. That's the oldest district heating steam system in the country. serves 3 million people. Wouldn't it be cool if that was, instead of burning stuff to make that steam, it was hot rocks in boxes, heated up by a turbine off of Long Island? That is 5 years away, maybe. The question is whether we use all these cool ideas to replace the dirty old stuff, and we don't just consume it with new ways like AI computing or cryptocurrency. We develop new ways to consume energy. It seems like almost faster than we can come up with the clean ways to make it.
Yeah, and then Betsy, you have I guess I'll call it a chapter on leapfrog, and you have several pieces, several letters that refer to the sort of imbalance on the planet. Like this one, K is for kilowatt. When you look at the energy menu of the average American or average European even, compared to the average person on the planet, there's no contest. And Wesley Allsbrook did this, use smoke clouds to kind of indicate the disparity, which gets to this point of something I feel very frustrated about. I'm sure you guys do at some level, is the lack of commitment by the rich countries, the carbonized countries, to do more for those who, to make leapfrogging more than a catchphrase. It was easy with mobile phones. It's not easy with energy. And so what do you think about that, Betsy?
Well, I mean, I several letters are devoted to these disparities, and I think it's really important, but very, very difficult. And we're kind of a increasingly inward looking country for Americans to look at this issue through the lenses of people around the world. But if you look at America through their eyes, if you're a Ugandan and your emissions are 100th of what a person in the US is, and then the Americans are complaining about whatever it is, some tiny trivial little curtailment of our activities, not you shouldn't be buying incandescent bulbs or whatever anymore, and you get a huge, outcry. It's incredibly self-indulgent on the part of Americans. It's incredibly short-sighted, because, this problem is only going to be dealt with globally, and a lot of, helping, investing in other countries taking a different path towards development. I mean, it's been understood since the very beginnings of thinking about climate change that would be the sort of cheapest and most effective way to confront this problem. Is don't India should not be developing along the very carbon intensive path that it's on. And if it requires a lot of investment from other parts of the world, so be it. Let's do it. And that has not happened. And we should all be extremely disappointed about this. But as I say, you can't pass an aid package for Ukraine, and you can't pass, a contribution to the Green Climate Fund through this Congress. So you just the levels, I was trying, as I say in this book, to sort of peel through some of those levels of the onion. And and when you do that, you see both the hopeful parts and the not so hopeful parts.
Yeah, and here you had one of my favorite brains on the planet, and he's a hard one to absorb as we try to think about progress, because he's really about the numbers, whatever they say, very unfiltered. And Bill and Betsy, again, as journalists, are grappling with the realities of these two factors. What's hopeful, what we see around us. Both books do a really good job of sort of getting across those two dimensions at the same time. Then there's weather. You talk about the reality, and Bill, you've reported on this over and over and over again, from Maui to Maine, right here, with our infrastructure. Our towns are not built for a purpose. My shoreline has a dock when we moved in here that was built in the 70s. It's gone. I'm trying to figure out how to repurpose it. It got destroyed in these recent flooding southerly storms. So infrastructure, adaptability going forward, these are all explored in both of your books. And then this one, X for xenophobia. This is right in the politics of the moment that Betsy just described too. And Bill, you've dealt with these issues as well in your journalism. If countries aren't developing fully, people are going to be moving for climatic and other reasons, just the sense of opportunity. So this is all entangled in that thing we call the climate crisis. And finally, why I'm kind of fast forwarding because we can come together again to discuss some more of this. But why is YOU? And your entry on this is a little bit on the finger pointing side of you, sort of like the Greta side. And that's a picture I took of Greta when she crossed the Atlantic and came to the UN. I was there for that day when she was in the crowd, Greta Thunberg, and she uses you in kind of a you need to, you adults, you grown-ups, you a-holes. But I think to me the you that really matters right now, and this is in both of your books, is the empowered you at the local level. As we said earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure law have created literally billions and billions and billions of dollars, but they only will get integrated into community actions if someone at the local level is there to make that the bridge. And that's what Jigar Shah said over and over again. So the you is definitely important. And then as Bill describes in his book, the you, how you define you, how much of you is bigger than you. It's about the future and not just your own children, but the next generations coming ahead on this planet is really matters as well. And Z was your closing letter for ground zero, not for net zero, which I was assuming it was going to be net zero, but you talk about net zero elsewhere. Climate change, and this is, I think you both have jumped onto what we've all come to realize is a lifetime journey. As Elizabeth says in this book, there's no solution. If you think of the old sense of solution. And Bill, you talk about character traits and community traits that can get us forward through this journey of building a new relationship with climate. It's about jettisoning the old idea of a fix, I think, and that it's a new relationship we're building and an old one we're unbuilding. So I'm really glad that we were able to come together today to discuss this on Earth Day. And the two books are just marvelous. Parts of the big prism of how this issue is being conveyed. Yesterday here, I hope somehow books can resonate and ramify more. Here in Maine, just yesterday, our community theater, the Lemoyne Community Arts Group, did a reading of the book by Ben Rollins, Along the Tree Line. And they created a theatrical presentation. This is like, Lemoyne is like 5,000, not even 5,000 people. And at the Grange Hall, they did a reading of his book on the changing tree line between the Arctic and the boreal parts of the world. And they did that because one person was inspired by the book to turn it into sort of a dramatic presentation. So the more these books get out and around, people can invent their own alphabet soup of climate activity and, think about their behavior as Bill describes in his book as a path forward. And thank you for being here today. To my two friends, the ospreys are off the nest now. They were just there. They were actually doing something that looked like propagating a minute ago.
You're X-rated.
Yes, no, I didn't show that. It's pretty funny, but thanks for being here with the osprey today on Earth Day, and good luck, with your work going forward. And I hope people can check out the books, and we can convene again sometime.
Thanks, Andy. So great to be with both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
And come to Maine.
Okay.
This is Andy Revkin. It's the Sustain What webcast, and you can share this as soon as we're done. LinkedIn, Twitter, even Twitch. It goes to Twitch. I've had 0 people on Twitch. Someone has to teach me Twitch. Thanks again.